Parsha is Parshat Vayechi. With it, of course, we conclude all of Sefer Bereshit. And Be'ezrat Hashem, may the coming Svarim bring for us the ability, maybe even to see each other in person. But in either case, Zoom is a wonderful thing, so we'll get started. I have three objectives this evening. Objective number one is I want to talk to you a little bit about Kever Rachel, because we know that Rachel Imenu's passing is recorded in Parshat Vayishlach, and there the Torah talks to us about her tragic passing, giving birth to Binyamin, and she's buried on the way. She's not buried in Hebron with Avram and Sarah and Yitzchak and Rivka, and eventually, of course, Leah will be buried there. But Rachel Imenu passes away on the way from Shechem to get to on the way he had hoped to get to the Marat HaMachpelah, but that was not to be Hashem's intent. So I'm going to show you a little bit. I've made some crude maps, but it should assist us in understanding what occurred. Now, first of all, I would imagine everybody here, if you've been to Eretz Yisrael, one of the main stops is Kever Rachel. Kever Rachel is the third most sacred place, at least according to many people. It's the third most sacred place. Yerushalayim, the Beit HaMikdash, Har Bayit, and then Hebron, and then Kever Rachel. Now, whether we don't have to really necessarily rank anything, we can simply say that it is a place that has a powerful spiritual draw for everyone. Now, the problem is, where exactly is Rachel Imenu buried? First of all, I want to say, of course, it doesn't matter whether you're in Dalet Amos of her actual Kvura or you're within 10 or 20 Amot. That probably is not so vital, because what is there is her spirit pervades the area. The question is, where was she buried exactly? When we go to Kever Rachel as it is now, we'll talk a little bit about what that is. When we go there now, we really go south of Yerushalayim, about 7 or 8 miles, maybe 6 kilometers, 5 kilometers. And I'm going to sort of give you a little bit of a view of it. I think you probably can see it. There we go. Okay. If we look here, here's Yerushalayim, and we're used to traveling south either by cab or driving or taking a bus. We go south. It's probably about a 15-minute trip from Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, especially to the, shall we say, from the old city to Kever Rachel, or what we call Kever Rachel now. Of course, it's assumed a completely different image than it did, let's say, even 2 or 3 decades ago. First of all, it's been revered. The site itself has been revered for centuries, and it underwent its main change so that it is housed within the building in which we go. In about 1840. Now, Rav Moshe Montefiore, who was truly the great benefactor of the Jewish community of the 19th century, at that time there certainly was no state. By 1840, there probably was not even a mention of a state. Herzl himself lived in, conceived of his idea of the Judenstaat, of the Jewish state. He conceived of it after 1895, sometime between 1895 and 1900, after the Dreyfus trial. So the idea of a Jewish state was not the issue. The idea is that there was a Jewish yishuv. The Jews lived there. And Montefiore visited the site, a very, very tranquil site. Even when I went there in 1977 for the first time, more than 40 years ago, it was just, I certainly wouldn't want to call it lazy. It was a tranquil little town, Beit Lechem. There was a little makolet across the street, and you could walk from, across the street from Kever Rachel, across the street. You could get a soda. You could get kosher ice cream. The sign was in Hebrew and in Arabic. A different world in 1977. But of course, with the Intifada and the assault of the Palestinian movement on all Jewish places, not to mention Jewish people, eventually the fortress of Kever Rachel was built around it. It takes away from the beauty, the tranquil beauty. It's necessary, but that's what it is now. So it's undergone in 1840. In 1840, when I think it was on Montefiore's second trip to Eretz Yisrael, extraordinarily wealthy man, Moshe Montefiore, a banker from England. He dedicated much of his life to not just the restoration, but the building of the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael. And that's why in Yerushalayim, for example, you have, of course, Montefiore's windmill, because he had hoped that he would give them some degree of diversification in how they made a living. There are Kiryat Moshe and various other places are called after Moshe Montefiore. On his second trip in 1840, he renovated Kever Rachel because it was in disrepair. And it assumed basically from 1840 all the way to 19 until actually into this century, 2001, 2, 3, something of that nature. Kever Rachel changed quite drastically, even though the essential element of it remains. But of course, a fortress was built around it. Okay. Now that we know that it is there, I would wonder if anybody, have you ever heard that there is a dispute about the real location of Kever Rachel? Any thumbs up that you've heard about it? Okay, of course, two Jews, there's always going to be an argument about where it is, that we know. But this one happens to be grounded in the understanding of legitimate Jewish sources. One of them, of course, is the Ramban. And the other one we're going to talk about, the Ramban lived in the year from 1195 to 1267, I believe. And so he was, quote, exiled from Spain to Eretz Yisrael. Such an exile should be decreed upon all of us, Be'ezrat Hashem. Let us hope that is so. After the Barcelona disputation, in which the Ramban clearly brought out the theological errors, other errors in Christian theology at that time, and clearly defended Judaism as very, very few people could before or even since. For this, he was banished, and he came to Eretz Yisrael in 1263. And the Israelis, by the way, really many of them consider the beginning of Shivat Zion, the beginning of the return of the Jews to Eretz Yisrael, which eventually would become a Jewish state, from the time of the Ramban. He wrote letters to his son about what shall we say, the very lonely state of Yerushalayim, the Ramban at that time. He had to scrape together $1 million. They had to literally send to Tzfat, far north, to get a Sefer Torah. They purchased a building with pillars, which he describes, which we now call the Beit Knesset Ramban. If you've ever been able to be there, it's worthwhile. It appears to be underneath the Chorva synagogue. It's not exactly underneath it, but it is right there. And if you have a chance to go to daven there, it is a very, very sacred place. Now, admittedly, it's a digression, but a necessary one, because we're going to take a look now and see what the Ramban says about where Kever Rachel is. And this particular statement he makes, this particular piece that he says, is actually back in Parshat Vayishlach, where the original incident of Rachel Imenu's passing is recorded. So I'm going to read for you a little bit of what the Ramban said, what the Ramban himself says. He knows that there is a disagreement about where Rachel Imenu is buried. And we're not talking about feet or a few amot. We're talking about miles. As a matter of fact, when I was in Eretz Israel, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years ago, I had a ride from Shiloh back to Yerushalayim, and the cab driver pointed to his left and said, Kan, ze kever Rachel. And I thought the guy, I would have, if it weren't the territory we're in, I was thinking, let me out of here. That's not kever Rachel. We're north of Yerushalayim, and kever Rachel is south of Yerushalayim. But then, of course, I looked at other writings of other great Jewish scholars, and in fact, there is a debate, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit in the first half of today's class. Here's what the Ramban writes. Now, remember, the Ramban was, quote, exiled to Eretz Israel, and he writes so movingly, he said, Katavti tchila, he said, I wrote on earlier about this, V'achshav shezachiti uvati ani liYerushalayim. Now that I, the Ramban, have come to Yerushalayim, it was a zechut for him to come to Yerushalayim. There was, there was no King David Hotel there, guaranteed. There wasn't even a makolet there, guaranteed. But zachiti shevach la'el atov v'ametiv. He says, and may praise that I bring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for bringing me to this. Again, this is right in Perak Lamed Vavai V'li Pasuk Tet Zayin. He writes on, and he quotes the fact that the Torah says that Yaakov Avinu didn't quite get to Hebron, but he did get a little bit within supposedly a relatively short trip to Beit Lechem. Okay, and here's what he writes, the Ramban. Ra'iti ani be'enai. I saw with my own eyes she'ein min kvurat Rachel leveit Lechem afilu mil. There is no distance between Kever Rachel and Beit Lechem, a mil, probably what we would call a kilometer. Kilometer can be traversed easily within a half hour. Okay, and indeed, some people say that the idea of Kivrat Eretz is a more or less a travel guide for people who are walking. That it was the amount that could be by the time you digest your breakfast, from breakfast to lunch, you can get to Beit Lechem from Kever Rachel. So according to this, Kever Rachel is north of our modern day Beit Lechem, and it's north of our modern day Beit Lechem. Here's Yerushalayim. And here is Beit Lechem, but we're gonna pay attention that this is called Beit Lechem Yehuda, and down here is Hebron. So that we know that those are absolutely static locations. We know exactly where they are. They're confirmed. Now, then he writes, there are those people, he says, that have a problem. Why? Because there's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu that says that kol b'Ramah nishma, a sound is heard in Ramah, right? Rachel mevaka al baneha. Rachel is crying for her children. Why? Because after the Churban Bayit Rishon, so the Jews were taken from Eretz Israel north and east all the way to Babylonia. And so therefore Yirmiyahu lived at that time. Yirmiyahu said, Kol b'Ramah nishma, Rachel mevaka al baneha. It's heard in Ramah. Now, if anybody knows where Ramah is today, Ramah is north of Yerushalayim, not south. Ramah is, you can actually see it from most parts of northern Yerushalayim. It's on a high hill. Shmuel HaNavi lived there. That's why it was called Ramah. The neighborhood in Yerushalayim is called Ramot. Probably a bit of a play on words, but Ramot is within 10 minutes of Ramah. But you have to go north. So now the question is is Rachel Imenu buried south or north? It would seem from the pasuk in Yirmiyahu that she must have been buried north, because Kol B'Ramah Nishma, the voice of Rachel Imenu crying over her children who are leaving Eretz Israel and going into exile, would seem it's in the north. So the Ramban dispels that view. The Ramban says no. He says, first of all, it doesn't mean that the sound is coming from Ramah. It means it could be heard even in Ramah, even miles away, kilometers away. Rachel Imenu's sigh and cry could be heard from the moment of the beginning of the exile. And if that's the case, that would resolve the question of Rachel seeming to have been buried in Ramah, which is north of Yerushalayim. He says, "V'chein amru b'sifrei." So it says, "V'chelko shel Binyamin meta." She died in the portion of the tribe of Binyamin. And let's take a quick look. She is buried. In other words, if you know Yerushalayim, once again, one of the things we say about Yerushalayim is, it's between my fingers, I think, right there, yes. If you can see Yerushalayim, where the Magen David is, half of the Beit HaMikdash is located in Shevet Yehuda on the south, and half down here, and half is in the north. So that Chazal talk about that, of course, why it's literally on the boundary. But so she was buried, at least according to Ramban, she was buried in Beit Lechem here, which is actually in Shevet Yehuda. She died, was buried here, and that's Beit Lechem. Now the question is, there are two Salem, Oregon. There are two Salems at least, maybe five. There's a bunch of Springfields. Is there more than one Beit Lechem? Is the question, right? So actually, to this we're going to turn to the great scholar of the 19th century, Tzvi Yaakov Mecklenburg, who wrote the sefer called Hakatav VaHaKabbalah. He, like many Chachamim of the 19th century, was a superb expert in, not so much in the geography of Eretz Israel, but in the language, in language, in Hebrew language. And we can learn a tremendous amount from him. Now, he says the following, that he says, first of all, he says, Kishemeta Rachel lo holachtia lekovra b'makom acher. When she died, I didn't go to bury her anywhere else. I couldn't. Lefi shemeta bein chelek Binyamin uvein chelek Ephraim, because she died far north of what we would call Yerushalayim, and even further north of what we call Beit Lechem. That's where she died. And it's interesting, who were Ephraim and who were Binyamin? Ephraim was Rachel Imenu's grandson, ultimately, right? And Binyamin was, of course, the son she bore shortly afterwards she died. So these two Shvatim, the territory of these two tribes, it would seem very significant that she could have actually been buried there on the border between the two. And that's what Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg says in his sefer, Kitav Kabbalah. Amar and he said he Beit Lechem. He said it is Beit Lechem, but the question is, which Beit Lechem? Lahodia afa pishen ikret ata Beit Lechem. Even though now it's called Beit Lechem, atida lihikarot Efrat. Later it will eventually become Efrat. Efrat is a variation of Ephraim. And so he says that there she was buried, and there she died, and there I buried her. He, B'chelek Ephraim, right on the border of Ephraim and Binyamin, Umashu B'chelek Yehuda. I said, but wait a minute, there is Kever Rachel, where there is a Beit Lechem that is the south of Yerushalayim. So he said, in Tanakh, it's the following. Beit Lechem itself is said just Beit Lechem. not Beit Lechem Yehuda, but Uma Shehu Bechelek Yehuda Nikreit Beit Lechem Yehuda. In other words, it's like, like where we have a branch of an institution. The main institution might be, let's say, the University of Illinois, and then it has a branch here in Chicago. So it might be University of Illinois, Chicago, UICC, but it identifies it as Chicago, or in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, whatever it may be. And so the real Beit Lechem that ultimately will be called Efrat, that Beit Lechem is in, he says, on the border between Binyamin and Ephraim, both, and so therefore their ancestor, the ancestor of both of these people, both these tribes, is buried right here. This would be, see if I can do this well for you. Okay, right here, that's the border between Ephraim and Binyamin. That's where she's buried, according to the Ketav Kabbalah. We'll never know. I personally would never be too terribly disturbed by this. And the reason is because we're going there because of what her spirit evokes. And it doesn't matter whether she's buried in Beit Lechem today, which is in Yehuda, or Beit Lechem, which is just south of Shiloh, right near the border of Binyamin, north of the Yerushalayim, not whether south or north, but what her spirit evokes within us. So for some people, the bad news is that the good news is she's not buried in a cemetery completely surrounded by Arabs. The bad news is she's a lot closer to Ramallah. So it's a toss-up, but it's all ours. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave all of it to us. And Be'ezrat Hashem, again, we have to be decent and good people. We have to be good neighbors. But on the other hand, Eretz Yisrael, Am Yisrael. So that takes care of the question of Kever Rachel. Does anybody have any questions you'd like to raise in the few minutes that we have? Yeah, Renee.
I do. Okay.
Yeah.
So thinking geographically, when they were coming, I assume they're coming from Lavan's, and they're going to see where Yitzchak is, which is probably closer to Hebron, correct, Rabbi?
Right. They're on their way from Shechem, coming down from south.
Okay. So I looked at that small bit of distance. Is that in the directions, and then they go back to Shechem? Did they ever make it down to Hebron? But it doesn't look geographic like it's
Did
so
whoever make it to
far
Hebron?
that they really could have brought her down to Hebron if it was that far south that she passed away.
Yes, well, if it was that far south. Yes. Now, actually, the Ramban deals with that. Others deal with it too. One of the statements is, Yosef says when he's going over this now, right? Just prior to his blessing the children, he's saying, those of you, of course, the descendants of Rachel Imenu may be very upset with me. Why did I do this? Why didn't I bring her to the kever that was designated for the avot and imahot? So he said, I couldn't. I simply could not. It was too far. And of course, the decomposition of the body, it was probably, well, she died in Cheshvan, right? She died in Cheshvan. But even then, Cheshvan still can be quite a warm month. So either way, number one, of course, if she's that far north, that explains it. What about your asked question is if she was really south, why didn't he go a bit further? First of all, you have to remember, he wasn't going just by himself. He had a whole entourage. That's the Ramban says. He had a whole entourage, not just people. He had animals, everything else. But the body decomposes relatively quickly. And it might have taken him while it was relatively short on a one-man journey or one-person journey, going that way would have been much more difficult. And then, of course, there's the digging of the grave. There's a lot that had to be done. So and the Meforshim also say that one of the reasons it's mentioned that he said, I buried her by the road, he said, is so that everybody would know where she would be. Many of us have had the experience of going to a cemetery that we're completely unfamiliar with and looking for. So here they didn't have to look. It was right on the road. It's still right on the road,
Right
but just now it's a little more hard to find. Any other questions concerning this? All right. I'm going to take another, if I may, just 3 or 4 minutes. Last week, I didn't have the opportunity to complete a thought that I had concerning all of us being, we're all, shall we say, spiritual midwives. If you recall, the question that we asked last week was, why did Yaakov stop at Beersheba? He didn't have to go. Beersheba was a bit out of his way. If he wanted to get there quickly, which you can imagine that he wanted to do, to finally see his son Yosef. So why did he stop at Beersheba? And the answer was given that he brought korbanot there. But the Medrash says, the Medrash Rabbi says, why did he stop? He stopped to pick up, to be able to cut down some trees of the Eshel. In this case, it must have been interpreted as an orchard that Avram Avinu had planted so that he could reach other people, because he either reached an Eshel is a tree. People reach God by intellectually understanding how purposeful the world is. When you look at a tree, the sap comes up, the sap comes down. It feeds people. It gives shade. It gives beauty. Ecologically, it helps the environment. Such a purposeful existence. So when people think of that, they say, well, it must be the product not of randomness, or random selection, but the product of a creator. A second thing is that Avram Avinu used the orchard to feed people when they came, the wayfarers. From that they got part of the food that they would eat. And the third possibility is, and so we reach God very often by the kindness of others. If you see a person is profoundly religious and they're profoundly sensitive, by the way, it isn't limited only to Jews. If you see, when you look at the Salvation Army, you look at things that people do, Mother Teresa, such a great personage. She was filled with compassion. So people say God must be good. And so in that sense, there's a tremendous Kiddush Hashem, certainly when we do it, and as Avram Avinu did it. And then the third way is by socialization. That's why we have youth groups. That's why we have synagogues. That's why we do the things that we do. And so the Eshel, some people say, was actually an inn which Avram Avinu created. By the way, they're not mutually exclusive. Could have been all three. No reason why not. So, but in this case, Yaakov Avinu goes, cuts down these trees so that eventually when we move and we transition from the family to the nation, and the symbol of that nation being the Beit HaMikdash, or in this case, the Mishkan, the focal point of the Jewish people's spirituality was the Mishkan. So he did it then. So Yaakov then was a spiritual midwife between Avram Avinu, who he and Sarah as individuals profoundly changed the worldview of God and the relationship of humans to God. He then made sure that when they left, they would have this Mishkan and the wood for the Mishkan. Now, that being the case, I want to just draw your attention to the very last psukim in all of Chumash. All right, the very last psukim in all of Chumash. It says that Vayamat Sham Moshe Rabbeinu died and was buried on Har Nevo, and the Torah tells us in maybe 7 or 8 psukim from the end that he died, and then the Gemara asks, wait a minute, what if he died before the Torah was completed? How can we have a completed Torah? So the Gemara said, the Rashi brings, Efshar Moshe meit v'chatav v'yamot sham Moshe. Is it possible that a human being can be alive and write about himself, and I died? Ella ad kan katav Moshe. One view in the Gemara is Moshe Rabbeinu wrote up until here. Mikan va'elech katav Yoshua, and the Torah, it's the physical writing of the Torah was completed by Yoshua, his student. Again, we start and others finish. Avram Avinu started and others finish. Life and Jewish history is sort of like a marathon, or sort of like a relay race, where each of us now takes a baton. And it was given to us by earlier generations. We're all sitting here learning Torah now because of decisions that people made hundreds of years ago to be Jewish, to be authentically as Jewish as they could be. And so therefore they pass it on to their children. There may be some glitches in the way, but nevertheless, that's why we're here. We know that we're Jewish because of those decisions. And so therefore, I think each of us, and with this I'll conclude, each of us really writes a Sefer Torah. Each of us in our life, we live, we are created, and we live our lives, and we do our best to live a life of integrity, to pass on what we know to those who are those who follow us, whether they're our children or they are our students or grandchildren or neighbors or whatever it is. And ultimately then they take it on. I just would like to say that I want to dedicate these last words in memory of a very dear person that passed away, a very dear friend of mine who lived his whole life with extraordinary integrity. He died as a result of COVID, not because of it directly, but Moshe Aaron Jacob Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha was a tremendous example for everyone. And I see his children and his grandchildren. He was indeed that midwife. He and his wife, she should live and be well. They are the midwives passing it on to their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. So let it be that we see ourselves as that we receive the baton, we run with it. Jewish history depends upon us. And then at some point, someone else, nobody completes the whole Sefer Torah. When we pass on, our contributions are now handed on to the next people. And Bezrat Hashem, at some point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring Mashiach Tzidkenu. So I thank you very much for listening. Mir Hashem, next week, Parshat Shemot. Kol Tov, everyone.
Thank you.
Fantastic as
Thank you,
usual.
Rabbi.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.